Rainbow Ranch, established in the late 1800s. Today we're going to meet Roger MacDonnell, who resides at the Rainbow Ranch. Roger is a descendant of the family that first settled here at Lake Country. Here we have the house, built in 1898 and added on to in later years. And welcome, Roger MacDonnell. This is the original Rainbow Ranch homestead. The centerpiece was built in 1898, and in subsequent years the two end wings were added. We're going to follow Roger into the living room. The participants on the tour this morning are from the Lake Country Museum and Archives. This familiarization tour will help us understand the history of Lake Country.
I just try to imagine what it must have been like 90 years ago.
Thank you. Morning, Rich. Morning, David.
Or more than 90 years ago.
Do you want us to take our shoes off?
No. After 90 years ago. Look. Oh, you're dead. Yeah. Sorry. I'm just checking out the porch because this.
Morning, Eleanor. Morning. Good to see you.
Thanks for this too. Are we allowed to talk?
Oh,
Yeah, well, find move books if you like, and yeah, find a place to sit. I was going to vacuum actually.
Good morning, ladies.
Good
morning. How are you?
Hey, man.
I'm going to sit up on that one.
Oh, I thought you were going to
Oh,
sit
no,
up.
sit here.
The girls didn't sit.
I'll stand over here, that's
I'm
fine.
not going to sit.
So Roger, when were the additions to the original house added onto?
Well, this shack here, that was Caesar's, and he bought this place from the Barr brothers. I think it was a preemption they had. They preempted a section, half section each or something, and then they went off to the Klondike, and Caesar lived in this shack, but he was up on the range. I don't know if, do you know where DeWonks used to be? And just over the fence and over Powell Road, there was a well, and I'm sure Caesar put that together, because they didn't have any trees. And what they did was take a well, and dribbled it into welded old hot water containers. They cut it in half and they welded them together, and they just had that trickle in. I mean, now they got a filthy dugout out there. You know, cows wade into it, and it's just a complete mess. But I think the well's still there. And Caesar lived up there, probably with a handful of cows. And then they brought it down here and made this place. And this place is about from the wall here out to just the other side of the wall there. And I'm sure, I've got this picture here has got a couple of drunken cowboys or something lying on the veranda. And I think they must have lived up in the peak of this small place. And that's 1898.
Wow.
And started adding, and 1903, it could have been, Powell could have done that. I've got a thing here, an itinerary, a list of dates my grandmother wrote up. And in 1893, Barr Brothers, 1896, and then 1905, Fred Powell bought it from Caesar. And 1906 to McAllister and Hewitt.
Wow. Would that have been Ernie's dad?
I don't know. You know, it's just the Powell
The
Road.
ages would be right.
Oh, yeah.
No. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know if he planted any trees, and I don't know who owns the A&W franchise over in Winfield, but for a long time there was a picture on the back wall, and it was a horse and buggy and a planted orchard towards Spine Cop, where Intrigue Winery is, looking from about that place there. And I went and asked, because I'd love to have that picture. But it might have been a Powell, horse and buggy, which everything was, I suppose. But
Interesting.
yeah, yeah.
I've got a picture of my dad from almost the precise same location, cutting it on a buzzsaw.
Oh,
Probably in the 30s.
oh yeah, yeah. Anyway, so they added on, I think by the time my grandfather came here, he came, I think they had just built this, but they were anticipating Dormer moving in, and which he did occasionally. He lived in the other wing. It's almost identical with the fireplace and all the rest of it, and he stayed there whenever he came through. And then they built another cabin down here, more had a porch and everything. And Nancy Land's, this is the front porch of that cabin in the 60s by Paul Jorgensen, who Nancy is, I don't know if you know, all of those are Paul's on that end.
Huh. He's quite an artist.
Even entranced with light at that point.
I didn't know.
And this is the shack. Eventually, a series of cooks, Chinese cooks, lived in it, and that was what Caesar lived in.
Where was that located?
Well, originally, it was up by DeWong's, near that creek, or that stream there. It's a trickle, and then it was moved down here. It's stuck beside this little place here, and eventually, until I was about 8 years old, where there was a garage here, that was an old root cellar, about the same place, and down at the end of it was Charlie's shack. And my grandmother wrote about, she wrote about two people that she was totally entranced with. And one was named Juan. He lived in that shack, and the next guy to live in it, and the last guy to live in it, I think, was Charlie, also a cook. Yeah, let me read this to you. I don't know when she wrote it. It's about Buon Bing. She's terribly annoyed with herself for not, oh, here it is. For not having a picture of him, because she absolutely the best thing ever. It was a strange experience to quite suddenly find myself in the heart of. This is terrible. I'm sorry, I've only got half the page here. Anyway, he would do all the things, and then he would dig out potatoes and trade them with who are living up and about the place for their turnips. And initially, all of them about 40 feet off the house here. We've got a picture of it at the museum, and it's just a big open space here. But initially they were selling 1 pound potatoes to the CPR, and they shipped them down to Okanagan Landing on the Sicamous, which would come in here.
And we're going next door.
No, it was right. Juan Bing would just go and dig up potatoes and go and trade and get all kinds of veggies in here and raspberries or whatever they had on hand. Miraculously turned up with all kinds of food that they weren't growing here. You just hike up, and he was on very good terms with the Japanese, as it says in this thing. I'll have to send all of this to you. Nancy Land, Nancy is going through a big stack of stuff. And it went through Anne to Nancy, and she's pawing her way through it and sending me stuff up as she thinks it would be of interest. This guy was Juan Bing, or his successor, Charlie, used to row across the lake in a clinker-built rowboat and fish on those cliffs, beside those cliffs over there. It just goes straight down. And I don't know what it was, but one day he came back, fish, and he described to my grandfather that this thing had come out, and it was a horse's head, like this, described exactly like this. I remember this when I was young, and it went by the boat, and then it went back down again. And he just got the oars out, and he came back, and he never went out on the lake again.
The end of his fishing.
That was the end of his fishing career.
Well, that's an interesting.
Well, you know, they bring in the New Year, Chinese anyway, with dragons and so on. So maybe he was just tripping out over there, and this
Had his opium pipe with him.
yeah. So
Makes you wonder where some of those eventually went.
Yeah. Well, in 1901, Bing, he left here, and he went to Princeton and started a laundry. And I guess maybe Charlie took over after that. I have no idea. So, or maybe a series of them. And there's a milk cow around and that sort of thing. But he was totally appreciated. This, you know, when we were talking with Dwayne and several people about the intermingling of and the attitudes, these things really reflect. They had some lovely Japanese girl in her, I don't know if it was in the mid-20s or she was in her mid-20s, but she did all kinds of things, and they just thought everybody smiled when she came into the room. And the kids loved her, and she would sit and have them on her lap and teach them English with a Japanese accent. And
we had lots of Japanese around, but we only had one Chinese when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Long bow. You've seen him in the early days. He had a market garden over on Seaton Road, and he would have traditional baskets with the yoke.
Wow.
Until he'd raised enough money to get 2 bicycle wheels.
Yeah.
Covered Winfield.
Huh, yeah. Anyway, well, Laura was going over some of this. He came out here in about 1905 or 6, and he, first of all, went down to the boundary, I think he went to the coast and then he came back and he went down to the boundary country, and there was a guy who ran, before they subdivided Naramata, he ran cattle in that area. His name was Val Haynes. He was a famous guy who punched cows around here. And my grandfather went, and I don't think he ever sat on a horse. He always had a buggy. He came from the east. They didn't go around sitting on horses. They had them pulled around. And he Penticton. And he was told that if the horse ran away on him, he didn't know really what that meant. Try and pull it in, just pull one rein so that the head starts to turn, and let him run. when you get to a place, an open place, start to pull that, and he'll start running, and then you go in a circle, and eventually he stops. And since I was about 4, that every time we passed, because we came through that way, or we had to go to the airport down in Penticton, before there was one here, and that place was pointed out where Jimbo, my grandfather, pulled a circle, and anyway, he punched for cattle in all that boundary country, all those ghost towns in there. There were mining towns, and one ran it. He had a letter from his brother-in-law, whose name was Cleland, to McAllister. And McAllister was looking for somebody to partner into this. And my grandfather, the whole family was born with silver spoons in their mouths. They had mills, and they built all of these mills just before and during the American Civil War, when the Americans were burning their wheat fields down in Kansas and making a mess of the whole place. And so they made a huge, lucrative business, milling wheat and selling it to the Americans. And eventually they sold this out. They were around Ayr, Ontario. Built a place that looks like a cathedral. I went with my wife in the 70s just to take a look at, and there is an old farmhouse there. There is the workers' cabins for the mill there, an old farmhouse. My great-grandfather had his leg amputated in that farmhouse, and across the road and down by the river was where my grandfather was born, in a nice little cottage, really. But eventually, you'll see in a bit, they had a 3-story mansion, and that's where he was raised. It was a Presbyterian, no music, no song, laughter, I suppose, was allowed. But on Sundays, he had a broomstick put in his elbows here, holding a Bible, and he had to walk around with his brothers and sisters. I don't think they had the broomstick, and he was supposed to be very read the Bible between services. And as far as I know, when he crossed the Rocky Mountains, he never went inside a church again. Maybe for the marriages of his daughters.
At what age did he come west?
Oh, he was in his early 30s.
And why did he come west?
Well, he was looking for something to. He found he had allergies because he was selling wheat. I mean, flour, and it just drove him nuts. And he wanted a place that was dry, and it was for his lungs, and so he came west without any idea, because when he got here, he didn't know a cow you fed. I mean, he really knew nothing, and he didn't know anything about punching cattle. He didn't.
And that was what year, Raj?
He's about 1906 or 1905, somewhere in there, because he had a couple of years before he turned up here. He was pulling railway ties off in Penticton, off of a flat deck, and anyway, he presented this thing, and he just happened, because he was one of his father had got a $10,000 life insurance policy for each of the kids, and had paid into it until, so you can imagine, he turned up here with equivalent of about $500,000, young guy in his 30s, and that got him a very handsome chunk of the rainbow as a partnering arrangement. And he stayed here. He got recommended by his brother-in-law, who had gone to engineering at the University of Toronto with McAllister. And
do you have maps or anything that shows the ranch at its largest and where its boundaries were and how large it was?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing that my mother did. This is very rough, but we do have blueprints of where the points were. It did go right up to Spine Cop.
Yeah,
Right onto the top. And when we're doing the geological survey where they were putting little
cairns.
They were canvas and poles, and then they were doing flyovers. They knew exactly where that was and how high it was and so on. They were mapping Canada, and that was in the early 50s. They became famous doing that. And he just said, okay, well, he's going to hand this back to the province or Canada, and he took a chunk out of the rainbow, and so that little area is this where all the teenagers go up on their motorbikes and fornicate and smoke dope and that sort of thing.